time to kick this mental health day off with some feel-good plant tonic. My good friend, Mr. Kratom.
Alright, hello. I'm Ben Boyce, and this is the Dr. Junkie Show. Today I want to dive back into a topic I've covered a few times in the past. Kratom, a drug something like 2 million Americans currently take every year. I had an episode a few years back with Dr. Oliver Grundman, I think his name was. He was in a hotel room at the time, so the audio is kind of bad. Anyway, we talked about pharmacology and why Kratom is a good harm reduction strategy for a lot of people because it's so much safer than other opioids in a lot of ways. And then I did another episode later on after I spent a few months getting off Kratom myself. That episode was called Set and Setting, a story about Kratom, and it was about the role of set and setting during not only drug use, but also during withdrawal. After that, I didn't use Kratom for almost 2 years, but I started taking it again recently when my hip flared up because, again, it's a pretty low-potency alternative to Vicodin. But also, I didn't have to jump through the ridiculous hoops that doctors' offices have started putting on anyone getting opioid scripts nowadays. And by the way, those restrictions are fucking infuriating. I have an active script that I can't refill without having my doctor write it every time. It's for 10 Valium and 20 Tramadol. Those are both Schedule 3 narcotics, which even the government classifies as, quote, low abuse and addiction potential. And they're both just about unheard of for somebody to overdose on. But to get those pills refilled at a pharmacy, which costs around $15, I have to also take 2 drug tests at the doctor's office. 2. One of them cost about $80, and the other one's a full panel that costs $250. My insurance only covers around half of that. That's the only way that my doctor will write the script right now. And that's complete bullshit because I can buy those same pills on the streets or on the dark web for around $30. That means my doctor is putting me and millions of other Americans in a position where I have to make a choice. Buy my drugs from underworld markets where they're less safe but way cheaper and where the seller never hassles me or insists, I don't know, to search the inside of my body before they'll sell me those drugs. I can get my drugs that way. Or I can go spend an hour with a doctor who doesn't trust me and who doesn't want to build a patient-doctor relationship on trust. They don't want to build it on asking me what I'm taking because they won't believe me anyway, but instead they want to build the relationship on insisting I pay way too much to be drug tested, and in the end I can pay around $200 between copays and pharmacy bills for the exact same drugs that I can get for a sixth that price without the indignity of peeing in a cup, of having a doctor tell me that they won't give me my medication unless I let them shake me down for a medical procedure I don't need, of being reminded that my doctor doesn't trust me and that this is not a relationship they even care to build on trust. All of that dumb shit for a script that I could theoretically consume all at once and not overdose. That's where our medical establishment is in the United States right now. But I digress. Kratom. One of the biggest reasons many of us use it is to avoid all that bullshit I'm talking about, because you can just order it online in most states, at least for now, and because it's so cheap. I pay around $60 a kilogram. That's 1,000 grams, and an average daily dose for most people is between 5 and 10 grams, meaning that a $60 bag of the stuff will last most users for months, if not longer. But if you're going to buy your Kratom online, or anywhere for that matter, make sure your dealer is testing their products for things like heavy metal or pollutants before they sell them. You can usually find that policy on the website, and if they don't have a policy, just go somewhere else. Little public service announcement. Kratom trees grow wild in areas of southeastern Asia. I've been trying to find one to buy for years now, so if you have one I can get a snipping off, email me. The drug kratom is literally just the leaves off that tree. In fact, most of us who use it swallow those raw leaves, dried up and then crushed into a powder. Although you can also smoke them, despite the taste being awful. It's like bitter and toxic. I mix mine with water and then drink it, but other people prefer to put the crushed leaves into gel caps so they don't have to taste it. It tastes like a leaf. In its natural form, kratom has been part of human life for a long time, maybe as long as opioids, for thousands of years. It was first brought to the Western world in the early 1830s, and from the start, it was usually used just like opium, as a pain reliever, and sometimes as treatment for opium addiction to minimize withdrawal symptoms when someone was trying to stop taking opium. But capitalists gonna capitalism. I think that made sense. And just like with coca leaves, which were made more potent and turned into powdered cocaine, and just like opium, which was made more potent and turned into morphine and then heroin, and just like cannabis, which was made more potent and turned into spice and K2, kratom started to get tinkered with in the lab a few decades ago as companies tried to extract the active ingredients, mitragynine and 7-hydroxymitragynine, and to sell them in more potent forms. That's where a lot of the problems come in with kratom, and with any drug, not in the natural form, which humans have been taking for a long time. We've been adapting to it for thousands of years. But in the synthetic forms that are hundreds of times more potent and missing a lot of the other ingredients, which we haven't yet fully studied, some of which might actually balance out certain aspects of the kratom buzz. Weed works the same way. One of the themes of this show is that link we keep seeing between consumerism and health. That when capitalist norms incentivize pharmacists to make plants more potent and less bulky, consumers end up suffering. The most natural form of any drug is almost always the safest form to consume. Kratom's no different. That kratom buzz, it's nice. It's like opium, my favorite drug, but much less intense and a bit more energetic. That energetic piece is probably because in addition to stimulating or activating the mu and kappa opioid receptors, the same neuron receptors that fire up when we get a dose of endorphins from running a long way or completing a big project, kratom also fires some of our A2 adrenergic cells, or adrenaline neurons. But kratom's pretty weak. It's something like 1/6 the potency of hydrocodone as an opioid, so the effects are nowhere near as extreme as most opioids, when used at reasonable doses at least. And when people try to get really high on it by consuming a lot of that leaf powder, it's a leaf, so they usually throw up before it can fully kick in. Possibly one of those built-in defense against overdose mechanisms I was talking about. And you don't want to throw kratom up, and yakking anything's gross. Anyway, that throwing up, that's a really good thing. Our body basically realizes, this guy's eating way too much grass out of the backyard. Make him throw it up before it gets us really sick. But when we take those high-dose concentrates, those potions brewed up by capitalists looking to distill the natural plant into something 10 times stronger, sometimes our body doesn't throw it up, even when we take a ton. That's where some of the biggest problems with kratom have come from: capitalism. And true to form, both the media and law enforcement have gone out of their way to misrepresent the arguments about kratom and to make it appear both more dangerous and easier to overdose on than it actually is. The normal media narrative about kratom is more often than not focused on the dangers of the product because that's what keeps people watching, engaged. Oh no, little Timmy up the street got his hands on a drug that killed him. I gotta keep my little Jimmy from getting his hands on that same drug. That news story will always get more views than the boring alternative, a recovering Vicodin addicted guy who works a regular, boring, full-time job, spends his evening watching reruns of Seinfeld, and goes to church every weekend. There's nothing to see here, folks. Try sending a news crew to cover that. But that's actually the story of the typical kratom user. Nothing to see here, folks. And that's why it's so hard to tell it in a compelling way. The story of illegal heroin ruining someone's life because of the war on drugs and causing them to turn to prostitution or crime? Now that's a fucking story I want to watch. And that's what we get. If you've heard anything about Kratom at all in the news, it's probably a back and forth that sounds something like this.
Kratom is made from a tropical tree in Southeast Asia and is now used by millions of people.
Saving lives or taking lives? An ABC6 On Your Side investigation into the herbal supplement Kratom is triggering drastic responses.
He credits the Kratom leaf for kicking his addiction to painkillers.
She called me after her son Johnny collapsed last year from a seizure and died. He took Kratom regularly.
Kratom, some users are defending the herbal substance as a pain relief option. But the FDA warns Kratom is dangerous and addictive and is technically illegal.
5 people have overdosed and died on Kratom alone. Since 2021, more than 40 overdose deaths include a Kratom combination.
For 7 years, Tekka says he's found relief from a spoonful of Kratom almost every day. He says it allowed him to stop taking prescription opioids.
Right now, you can go to the local gas station down the street, and you have a choice of grabbing the Kratom or grabbing a Reese's bar.
It's quite the disorienting spin from this dangerous drug is out there killing our kids to this stuff saved my life, helped me get through an addiction I never thought I'd get through, paved the way for me to become the person I am today. Those are two very different stories. And even though they're both out there, one is sexy and dangerous and intense. It says, pay attention, this is important. Humans are hardwired to prefer the salacious over the boring everyday norm, and mainstream media is hardwired to feed us what we want. And if you want an idea about which of these stories is gaining more ground, just pay attention to which way the laws are slowly creeping. Regulation and medicalization of a substance and the people who use it tends to be the best route to harm reduction. And as always, outlawing and stigmatizing particular drugs tends to be the lawman's preferred method of control. And Kratom actually is illegal to sell in a lot of places in the U.S. now. It's illegal to possess in Alabama, Arkansas, Indiana, Rhode Island, Vermont, and Wisconsin. In Denver, where I live, where we supposedly changed our ideas about the war on drugs a decade ago, it's currently illegal to sell it for human consumption. Weird. Same in a few neighboring towns, like Monument and Parker down south, the We Hate Addicted People areas just outside Denver. Actually, it's on topic, so I already have a bit of a beef with uppity-ass Monument. This is a place where Dirty Woman Creek is an attraction to tourists, and where Mount Herman was, until recently, a free access road where good old boys, myself included, could go shoot guns. They recently changed that last rule to make it illegal because so many people were leaving behind their shit, shooting up their old TVs. But my point is that it's just a small country town 45 minutes south of Denver. It's the sort of place you'd normally think values the adage of live and let live, but not if someone who has struggled with addiction wants to pick up their methadone or Suboxone or Kratom. Then fuck that, get them out of here. But let's remind ourselves what a government is really doing when they make drugs like Kratom or methadone, which Monument has also worked really hard to ban. A few years ago, they actually had a fully approved, taxes and license already paid methadone clinic that was ready to set up shop, and residents fought to prevent it, even though they wound up having to pay the business a settlement because they'd already approved their permit and then pulled it with no good reason, except stigma. So what happens when they ban safer, softer forms of a drug? It's the same thing that happens when my doctor starts making me jump through $200 shakedown hoops to get my medication after decades of getting it without those fucking hoops. They drive those of us who use those substances underground. They send us from the medical establishment to the dope house, from Vicodin to heroin, from methadone to fentanyls, from the pharmacy to the streets. And does anyone really believe that when you tell somebody who's using a substance that they just can't have it, they're gonna stop using? Really? Anyway, enough about Monument and Parker and all the other U.S. cities that seem to hate addicted folks. I really don't need to get pulled over there on my way down to teach prison classes, and I drive through there all the time. They actually have a pretty cool indoor go-kart track if you're ever in the area. Just bring your own drugs. There. Hopefully that pitch balanced out all the shade. So, Kratom. It's actually a lot more common in other areas of the world than it is here. Mainly, obviously, where it grows in the wild, like in Indonesia. And over the past decade, in a very US-sounding cultural trend, lots of young adults in Thailand have started using kratom as the main ingredient in a drink they call 4x100. It's basically the Thai version of lean, cough syrup or codeine, Sprite and Coca-Cola, and kratom. Then they heat it up like coffee and sip away while they're partying. But that's not the sort of scene we have here in the US. It's very rare that people are walking into stores and buying kratom without knowing what it is or having the ability to do some basic research online. There have been some real medical problems now verified to have been caused by kratom. Again, you can find these online. And even some overdose deaths now that look from the reports like they were fully the result of kratom consumption with no other drugs in the person's system. But when was the last time you heard the news reporting on a local rave where the kids drank leaf juice? In the US, we normally take our scary drugs as powders and pills. Even weed, one of my favorite daily drugs, has basically gone out of style, at least in flower form. We've long since traded our natural products for overregulated and overproduced capitalist tinctures and pills, a theme that seems to be showing up throughout this episode alongside the overregulation of drugs. So all this to set the stage for what's currently happening right now in the United States. We're kind of deciding whether kratom will remain legal and unregulated, at least at the federal level, or whether we're going to outlaw it and classify it alongside so-called dangerous drugs. You know, like my Valium that requires a $200 door charge. P-test, wink wink, to get it from a doctor. The second Trump term has been a whirlwind in the early weeks, but given the other conservative Project 2025 bullshit that he's been doing, like trying to legislate trans people out of existence and pardon his way out of historical records of the 2021 election, it wouldn't be at all surprising if anti-vaccine, anti-SSRI, anti-don't eat that roadkill or you'll catch a brainworm RFK, our Director of Health and Human Services, Jesus, what a joke. Anyway, it wouldn't be a surprise at all if he tried to outlaw it. And the war on drugs loves new additions to their enemies list, new substances that can be targeted, new task forces that can be formed with new raises and promotions for new detectives and sergeants. And whenever you ban something, the iron law of prohibition says that the most potent form of the drug will quickly become the most common form, because once a drug has to be smuggled into an area, size matters a lot. You don't want to smuggle in 10,000 pounds of Vicodin if you can instead smuggle in 50 pounds of fentanyl and then press that fentanyl into Vicodin pills after mixing it with some sort of filler. Since kratom is so bulky, again, it's literally a leaf in its natural form, we can expect any bans to result in people simply choosing more potent drugs, either stronger forms of mitragynine and 7-hydroxymetragynine, or Vicodin, morphine, heroin, fentanyl, whatever similar drugs they can get on the streets. Why carry around 20 grams of bulky illegal kratom powder to dose 4 times a day when it's the same crime as fentanyl and I can just carry around a 1/4 gram of that to get me through the same day? But in the kratom conversation, unlike conversations about drugs like heroin or fentanyls or cocaine, there's a big counter-narrative that's included in those mainstream media dialogues. Those people saying it saved their lives or that it got them off other opioids. Those folks are also supported by capitalist institutions, organizations of medicine, psychology, addiction treatment. They all have loud, well-known voices who currently support keeping this drug legal and actually making it safer. We don't only hear the stories about someone dying or becoming addicted to kratom, we also hear challenges to those narratives in the form of stories about recovery using kratom. And the stories we hear about a drug matter. The last year or so of this podcast has really tried to focus on that in these times of rapid changes in our social perception of drugs like ketamine, cannabis, or Molly. And that's because of the other piece of our culture that I've been talking about for a few months, the nature of neoliberal capitalism. Anytime a drug threatens the status quo of capitalist production, it'll be depicted to the public as dangerous, deadly, and addictive. And whenever a substance supports the underlying structure and norms of capitalism, it will be embraced, regulated, celebrated. Think about Molly, or MDMA in medical terms, methylene deoxymethamphetamine. Think about how it's gone from rave drug partying kids took that threatened their safety to a psychological treatment breakthrough for depression, and it's all happened in less than 2 decades. And think about how that required established, respected medical professionals embracing it, getting permission to test it using the accepted medical system, and then establishing treatment standards that are designed to, wait for it, make sure that after you pay big bucks to an established, licensed capitalist institution, a therapist who gives you MDMA, that you're more able to go punch the damn clock tomorrow. If the effects of MDMA lasted for, say, 36 hours, or if MDMA often made people see the world in a new way that made them, say, quit their jobs the next day, well, then it wouldn't be so accepted because it would clash against the status quo. The story we tell ourselves about a drug impacts the way we feel about that drug. Now that doctors, status quo, have established medical procedures, status quo, that are meant to treat patients, status quo, and make them less depressed, more equipped to manage contemporary cultural norms of anxiety and consumerism, status quo. And they can get patients, consumers, to spend money on treatments that benefit both local professionals and businesses, but also the state through taxation, status quo. The stories we have about that substance, Molly or whatever comes along next, they're going to be accepting. The story we've come to accept about Molly is nothing like the story that I was taught to accept as a kid. I was actually told that it gave users holes in their brains and led to permanent serotonin problems. In the early 1970s, Tim Leary fucked up the acid scene by not quite understanding this cultural requirement, that if a drug is ever to be publicly accepted, the public discourse about it must shape the public understanding of that drug in such a way that it doesn't appear to threaten the status quo, and if possible, it appears to support it. The drug, in the minds of the citizens, must work alongside or even prop up the normal operations of daily society. Capitalism, commerce, travel, consumption, religious ritual. And if not, that drug will come to be seen as a public threat to the social order. Leary's famous line was turn on, tune in, and drop out. From college, from your job, from the government, from voting, all of it. That's not the sort of go to work so you can make enough money to spend it this weekend on products and treatments that make you just well enough to go back to work on Monday message that reinforces the status quo. That's a big part of why LSD is still so stigmatized. Well, that and the fact that it kind of does make a good portion of the people who use it realize they've been dulled out, self-deceiving, self-medicating zombies, working jobs they hate and wasting their lives. And then they do sometimes drop out, so acid remains largely feared by the public and misunderstood by many drug users, even people that use it. So Kratom is a drug that I really hope remains legal and accessible, and I think we should all be working to keep it that way, as well as to regulate it, to educate the public about effects and possible dangers, and to make sure it remains affordable and accessible to people who would otherwise opt for some more potent form of an opioid. There's a lot of big mainstream doctor-supported groups you can check out if you want to get involved or learn more. I suggest starting with the American Kratom Society. But that's the short story on Kratom. It's done a ton in my life. I continue to use it to this day, but it is a drug that can be dangerous, like any drug, if used the wrong way. As always, this show doesn't offer anything like medical advice. I'm not a medical doctor, and you should never do anything I say, but the social issues surrounding Kratom are really important to all of us. Oh, by the way, next week I think I'm going to have my dad come on the show, so that should be a blast. And if there's something you want to know about him, send me an email. In the meantime, love yourselves and the addicted people in your life. I'm Ben Boyce.
Another Nevada bill seeks to effectively ban the herbal supplement Kratom, which has been blamed for or linked to hundreds of overdose fatalities over the years. The CDC and DEA says Kratom can mimic opioid-like effects.